The rhinoceros, an extinct animal in Cambodia. The story of the rhinoceros in Cambodia is a tragic tale of ecological loss, representing one of the most devastating examples of wildlife extinction in Southeast Asia during the modern era. Once roaming the forests and grasslands of the Cambodian landscape, these magnificent creatures have vanished completely from the country, leaving behind only memories, historical records, and a stark reminder of the fragility of biodiversity in the face of human pressures. Historical presence in Cambodia. For centuries, rhinoceroses were an integral part of Cambodia's wildlife heritage. The Javan rhinoceros, Rhinoceros sondaicus, and the Sumatran rhinoceros, Dicerorhinus sumatrensis, two species of Asian rhinoceros, once inhabited the forests of Cambodia alongside other megafauna such as tigers, elephants, and wild cattle. These animals played crucial roles in their ecosystems, acting as seed dispersers and habitat engineers that shaped the landscape through their feeding and movement patterns. Historical records and temple carvings from the Angkorian period provide evidence of the rhinoceros's presence in Cambodia's past. Ancient bas-reliefs at Angkor Wat and other temple complexes occasionally depict these animals, suggesting that they were known to the Khmer civilization and possibly held cultural or symbolic significance. French colonial records from the 19th and early 20th centuries also documented sightings of rhinoceroses in the country's dense forests, particularly in the remote northeastern and eastern regions. During the early 20th century, rhinoceroses could still be found in Cambodia's extensive wilderness areas, particularly in the Cardamom Mountains, the Elephant Mountains, and the forested regions bordering Vietnam and Laos. However, their populations were already under pressure from habitat loss and hunting, setting the stage for their eventual disappearance. The decline and extinction. The decline of the rhinoceros in Cambodia accelerated dramatically throughout the 20th century, driven by multiple interconnected factors that created a perfect storm of destruction. The species faced threats from all directions, and their slow reproductive rate made recovery increasingly difficult as populations dwindled. Habitat destruction emerged as one of the primary drivers of rhinoceros decline. Cambodia's forests, which once covered the majority of the country, were steadily cleared for agriculture, logging, and human settlement. The expansion of rice cultivation, the establishment of plantations, and the extraction of timber reduced the available habitat for these large herbivores, fragmenting populations and limiting their ability to find adequate food and breeding opportunities. The impact of warfare on Cambodia's wildlife cannot be overstated. The decades of conflict that plagued Cambodia from the 1960s through the 1990s, including the Vietnam War, the Khmer Rouge regime, and subsequent civil wars, had catastrophic effects on the country's natural environment. Forests were bombed, cleared for military purposes, and abandoned as lawlessness prevailed. During these periods of chaos, wildlife protection became impossible, and the rhinoceros population suffered tremendously from both direct killing and habitat destruction. However, the most devastating threat to Cambodia's rhinoceroses was poaching, driven by the insatiable international demand for rhinoceros horn. In traditional Chinese medicine and other Asian medical systems, rhinoceros horn has been falsely believed to possess healing properties, from reducing fever to treating various ailments. Despite scientific evidence that rhinoceros horn is composed primarily of keratin, the same substance found in human fingernails, and has no proven medicinal value, the demand has remained strong, particularly among wealthy consumers in Vietnam, China, and other Asian countries. The value of rhinoceros horn on the black market has been staggering, sometimes exceeding the price of gold by weight. This economic incentive created an unstoppable force of poaching that decimated rhinoceros populations not only in Cambodia but across Asia and Africa. In Cambodia, where law enforcement was weak or non-existent during periods of conflict and political instability, poachers operated with virtual impunity, hunting the remaining rhinoceroses to the brink of extinction. The final years. By the 1980s and 1990s, rhinoceros sightings in Cambodia had become increasingly rare. Conservation organizations and government agencies began to recognize that the species was on the verge of disappearing entirely from the country. Efforts to locate surviving individuals intensified, with researchers conducting surveys in the country's remaining wilderness areas, particularly in the eastern provinces near the Vietnamese border. In the early 1990s, there was brief hope when a small population of Javan rhinoceroses was discovered in Cat Tien National Park in Vietnam, just across the border from Cambodia. This discovery raised the possibility that a few individuals might still survive in adjacent Cambodian forests. However, extensive surveys failed to produce confirmed sightings, and even the Vietnamese population was eventually reduced to a single individual, which died in 2010, marking the extinction of the Javan rhinoceros in mainland Asia. For the Sumatran rhinoceros, the story was similarly bleak. This smaller, hairier species once ranged across much of Southeast Asia, but its populations collapsed dramatically in the late 20th century. In Cambodia, the last confirmed evidence of Sumatran rhinoceros presence came from tracks and other signs found in the 1990s, but no living animals were observed. By the turn of the millennium, conservationists had concluded that the species was functionally extinct in Cambodia, with no breeding population remaining. The official declaration of the rhinoceros as extinct in Cambodia came after years without any credible sightings or evidence of surviving individuals. While the exact date of the last rhinoceros in Cambodia remains unknown, most experts believe that the species disappeared from the country sometime in the late 1990s or early 2000s. This loss represented not just the disappearance of a species from a single country, but the elimination of an entire branch of Cambodia's evolutionary and ecological heritage. Ecological impact. The extinction of the rhinoceros from Cambodia has had significant ecological consequences that extend far beyond the loss of a single species. Rhinoceroses, as large herbivores, played important roles in their ecosystems as what ecologists call ecosystem engineers. Their feeding habits, movement patterns, and physical presence shaped the landscape in ways that benefited numerous other species. Rhinoceroses are browsers and grazers that consume large quantities of vegetation, including young trees, shrubs, and grasses. By feeding on these plants, they helped maintain open areas within forests, creating habitat diversity that supported different plant communities and the animals that depended on them. Their wallowing behavior, in which they roll in mud to cool themselves and protect their skin from parasites and sunburn, created small ponds and wetlands that provided water sources for other wildlife during dry seasons. As seed dispersers, rhinoceroses contributed to forest regeneration by consuming fruits and other plant materials and depositing seeds across wide areas through their dung. Some plant species may have depended on rhinoceroses for seed dispersal, and their extinction could have contributed to changes in forest composition over time. The loss of rhinoceroses also represents the removal of a prey species for large predators, although adult rhinoceroses have few natural enemies. Young rhinoceroses, however, could fall victim to tigers, which were also once present in Cambodia but are now extinct in the country. The disappearance of megafauna like rhinoceroses and tigers indicates a broader collapse of Cambodia's large mammal community, with cascading effects throughout the food web. Conservation lessons and failures. The extinction of the rhinoceros in Cambodia offers important lessons about conservation failures and the challenges of protecting endangered species in developing countries affected by conflict and poverty. Several key factors contributed to the inability to save Cambodia's rhinoceroses, and understanding these failures is crucial for preventing similar losses in the future. First, the lack of political will and resources for conservation during Cambodia's most turbulent decades made it impossible to protect wildlife effectively. During periods of war and political instability, conservation was understandably not a priority for a government and population struggling with survival. However, this meant that poachers and illegal loggers operated freely, devastating wildlife populations without consequence. Second, the international community's failure to effectively combat the illegal wildlife trade allowed the demand for rhinoceros horn to continue unabated. Despite international agreements such as the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species (CITES), which banned the commercial trade in rhinoceros products, enforcement has been weak, and criminal networks have continued to traffic rhinoceros horn around the world. Third, insufficient scientific knowledge about Cambodia's rhinoceros populations hampered conservation efforts. By the time serious surveys were conducted to assess the status of the species, it was already too late. Earlier intervention based on better data might have allowed for captive breeding programs or intensive protection measures that could have saved at least some individuals. Finally, the failure to engage local communities in conservation efforts meant that the people living closest to rhinoceros habitat had little incentive to protect the animals. In many cases, poverty drove people to participate in poaching or to clear forests for agriculture, seeing wildlife as either a source of income or a competitor for resources rather than as a valuable natural heritage worth preserving. Current conservation efforts in Cambodia. While the extinction of the rhinoceros in Cambodia cannot be reversed, the country has made significant progress in wildlife conservation since the end of its civil conflicts in the late 1990s. The Cambodian government, with support from international conservation organizations, has established a network of protected areas covering important ecosystems and has worked to strengthen law enforcement against poaching and illegal logging. Organizations such as the Wildlife Conservation Society, WWF, and Fauna and Flora International have partnered with the Cambodian government to protect remaining wildlife populations, including Asian elephants, sun bears, gibbons, and various endangered bird species. These efforts have included ranger patrols, community-based conservation programs, and initiatives to combat the illegal wildlife trade. Cambodia has also worked to strengthen its legal framework for wildlife protection, updating its laws and increasing penalties for wildlife crimes. However, enforcement remains challenging due to limited resources, corruption, and the sophisticated nature of international wildlife trafficking networks. The country has made some notable conservation successes in recent years, including the protection of significant populations of endangered waterbirds in the Tunnel Sap Lake ecosystem and the rediscovery of species previously thought to be extinct in Cambodia, such as the Siamese crocodile. These achievements demonstrate that with sufficient commitment and resources, wildlife conservation is possible even in a country recovering from decades of conflict. The global rhinoceros crisis. Cambodia's loss of its rhinoceros populations is part of a global crisis affecting all 5 rhinoceros species. Across Africa and Asia, rhinoceroses continue to face intense poaching pressure driven by the persistent demand for their horns. The black rhinoceros and white rhinoceros of Africa, while more numerous than their Asian counterparts, lose hundreds of individuals to poachers each year, primarily in South Africa, which hosts the majority of the world's remaining rhinoceroses. In Asia, the situation is even more dire. The Javan rhinoceros survives only in a single population of fewer than 80 individuals in Ujung Kulon National Park in Indonesia. The Sumatran rhinoceros, once widespread across Southeast Asia, now numbers fewer than 80 individuals scattered across Indonesia and possibly Malaysia, making it one of the world's most endangered large mammals. The greater one-horned rhinoceros, found in India and Nepal, has fared somewhat better due to intensive conservation efforts, with populations growing to around 4,000 individuals, but it remains vulnerable. International conservation efforts have intensified in recent years, with increased funding for anti-poaching operations, the deployment of new technologies such as drones and DNA analysis for tracking illegal horn, and efforts to reduce demand through education campaigns in consumer countries. Some controversial approaches, such as legalizing rhinoceros horn trade or flooding markets with synthetic horn, have been proposed but remain deeply divisive within the conservation community. Cultural and historical significance. Beyond their ecological importance, rhinoceroses held cultural and historical significance in Cambodia and throughout Southeast Asia. These animals appear in folklore, traditional art, and religious symbolism across the region. Their impressive size and distinctive appearance made them memorable and inspiring to the people who encountered them, and their presence in temple carvings suggests they were known and valued by ancient Cambodian civilizations. The loss of the rhinoceros represents not just an ecological tragedy but also a cultural impoverishment. Future generations of Cambodians will never have the opportunity to see these magnificent animals in their country's forests, and the living connection between people and this part of their natural heritage has been severed. This cultural loss is difficult to quantify but no less real than the ecological damage caused by the species extinction. Possibilities for the future. While the rhinoceros is extinct in Cambodia, there have been discussions about the possibility of reintroduction programs that could bring the species back to the country. Such efforts would face enormous challenges, including the need to secure surviving populations from other countries, the necessity of rebuilding suitable habitat and protection systems, and the requirement for long-term commitment and funding. Successful reintroduction programs for large mammals have been achieved in other parts of the world, offering some hope that similar efforts could work in Cambodia. However, any such program would need to address the underlying causes that led to the species' extinction in the first place, including poaching, habitat loss, and weak law enforcement. Before reintroduction could be contemplated, Cambodia would need to demonstrate that it can effectively protect its remaining wildlife, and that the threats that eliminated rhinoceroses in the past have been adequately addressed. This would require sustained political commitment, adequate resources for conservation, and the engagement of local communities in protection efforts. Conclusion: the extinction of the rhinoceros in Cambodia stands as a sobering reminder of how quickly magnificent species can disappear when protection fails and human pressures become overwhelming. These animals, which survived for millions of years of evolution and adaptation, could not withstand a few decades of intensive poaching and habitat destruction. Their loss diminishes not only Cambodia's biodiversity but also the global natural heritage that belongs to all of humanity. The story of Cambodia's rhinoceroses is ultimately a tragedy of human choices and priorities. During periods when survival and political power took precedence over conservation, wildlife paid the ultimate price. The international community's failure to effectively combat the illegal wildlife trade and the persistence of superstitious beliefs about rhinoceros horns' medicinal properties created the economic incentives that drove the species to extinction. However, this tragic history also offers important lessons for the future. As Cambodia continues to develop and strengthen its conservation capabilities, the country has the opportunity to prevent similar losses among its remaining endangered species. By learning from past failures, strengthening law enforcement, engaging communities in conservation, and addressing the root causes of wildlife crime, Cambodia can work to ensure that no more species follow the rhinoceros into extinction. The empty forests where rhinoceroses once walked serve as a powerful symbol of what has been lost, but they can also inspire renewed determination to protect what remains. While we cannot bring back Cambodia's rhinoceroses, we can honor their memory by fighting to ensure that the country's remaining wildlife survives and thrives for future generations. The extinction of the rhinoceros in Cambodia is a closed chapter in the country's natural history, but the story of its wildlife conservation is still being written, and there is still time to create a more hopeful ending.